This is a brief video lecture to give you a little bit of information and some tips about how to fulfill the first assignment in our course, English 311 this semester. That is writing a personal narrative. The assignment is actually given at the end of the first chapter, where you'll read about what goes into a personal narrative and read some examples of good writers who have written personal narratives. And then it asks you to write a personal narrative to submit for a grade. And basically, you can just do that, or you can try to make your personal narrative a little bit more than just fulfilling the assignment. And these tips are designed to give you some tips on how you might punch up your narrative and make it a little more compelling than just fulfilling the letter of the law here, or the letter of the assignment. So let's look at some of these tips. The first tip is that a narrative has to be about you or someone you know who is actually involved in this situation. Not a very difficult thing to comprehend, something you probably would have thought of, but if you're writing a narrative about something that is happened to someone you really don't know and you're not very close to that situation, then you're probably not going to write a very good account of it. You really need to have an intimate knowledge of that. And in this case, probably it's a narrative about something that happened to you. The second tip is to include the element of choice. People make decisions all the time, and decisions can have good outcomes or they can have bad outcomes. And that's the kind of thing that makes for an interesting narrative. Readers want to know what those outcomes were, how that decision that seemed so innocent at the time led to the events that seemed so interesting and maybe disastrous or maybe very good later on in your narrative. So make sure that you think about the decision that actually led to the course of events that you're unraveling for the reader in your narrative here. Also, a narrative is a moving picture, kind of like a video rather than a still photo. It's a series of events. It's a narration that takes you through a series of activities and events that led to something interesting for the reader to understand and to hear about. So to make that narrative a moving picture, you want to think in terms of your audience. Think in terms of how you are going to let your reader see for himself or herself what's actually going on here, or to hear the sounds that were going on at the time, or smell things, what the touch of something might be like. So think in terms of sensory experiences for your reader that will bring them centrally into the narrative and kind of relate to the activities that you're trying to convey in your narrative. Also think about the element of time. You could start your narrative thinking about the first thing that happened, going on to the next thing that happened, and kind of take us through all of the things that led up to the climax, or the fulfilling of the story that you're trying to tell here, the final outcome of it. But it might be more interesting, and it is usually more compelling to a reader, to start in the middle of things. Let the reader wonder what you're getting at, where you're going with this whole idea. Describe a circumstance that took place, and then fill in the previous information by flashbacks or other background information that you might bring in to the story to relate to the reader what went on to bring things to the point at which you're describing them when you join the narrative. And then, of course, proceed to tell the story from there on. But don't think in terms of chronological necessarily. Think in terms of how you might start in the middle of things and compel the reader to get more interested right away. You want to include suggestive detail. Detail is what a narrative is all about. You really need to think about the kinds of things that will draw the reader in by describing details, the temperature of a room, the dust that rises up from the streets in a southwestern town, for example. The sensory experiences and the detail that will allow the reader to kind of be experiencing what you're trying to relate firsthand, rather than you just telling the reader what's going on. But you don't want to overwhelm your reader in detail. If you get too much detail, you can be distracting. And you'll also slow the pace of your narrative down a little bit. So use detail. It's very emotive. It allows the reader to see things and experience things, but don't overdo it. A series of episodes that build on each other is also an important detail. So you might have a series of things that are little vignettes, little dramas, so to speak, that happen to you or happen to you, the person involved as the person in your narrative here that experienced this story that you're telling us. And there might be a sequence of things that one thing led to another. And if you think of your narrative as a series of these episodes or events that took place and tie them together with very brief transitions where you kind of cut back on the detail and move into the next episode where you, again, engage the reader with more supplying of detail, you'll find that that's a very compelling and a good way to organize your thinking and tell your story very effectively. And finally, it's very often a good idea to have a climax. Most good writers will have a point at which all of the action in the story, all of the events in the story, or the episodes of the story lead to some cataclysmic event, something that is explosive or resolves a lot of tension that's building up and has suddenly exploded onto the scene in some dramatic exhibition of what happened as a result of all of the things that you've been talking about in your narrative and all the episodes that have built up to this point at which everything kind of explodes. And after you've done that, you want to come to the end of your narrative with something that resolves all of this thing, ties up all of the loose ends, and that's called a denouement. So think in terms of how you're going to tie it all together after you've kind of built the reader up through this series of episodes to an explosive kind of climax. And that doesn't need to be overly dramatic. It can be fairly mild, but it has to kind of tell the reader that here is where all of this led to. And then tie it up, resolve it, tell the reader what the reader needs to know in order to understand how this story came out, and that's your denouement. So those are a few tips that can take you beyond just writing a straightforward kind of chronological narrative.